This is lecture 13. We're talking about freshwater wetlands all the way to coral reefs, marine systems. Introduction to environmental science, we're moving right along. What was, what is, and where are we going to protect and restore these ecosystems? So some questions, we'll be able to fill in these blanks after this lecture is over with. Maybe you can do them now. So what is the natural receiving water body for the Lake Okeechobee watershed? Well, that's a good question. Perhaps you know. You'll know by the end of this. Irrawaddy River dolphins. They're found in the Irrawaddy River, but where is that exactly? We'll talk about that too. The marine ecosystem with the highest level of biodiversity. That one we've talked about, you should know. And where is the Chavez Marine Reserve? That is a very interesting place. We're going to look at that also in this lecture. So, wetlands to estuaries. First, we're going to back up a little bit into the previous lecture about sustainable water supply systems. An urban example, how do you do that? And we're going to talk about wetlands themselves. What is being done very locally? By very locally, I mean on the land in the county that we're in right now. We're going to spend a bit of time in the Everglades, from the Everglades into a place called Florida Bay, and then go to those dolphins of the Irrawaddy to find out where that is. Moving a little bit further offshore, mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs. What are mangroves and seagrasses? What's their use? Florida corals. It's not just the keys. It's one of the things that I've learned in putting this together is it's more than just the Florida Keys. And then coral reef ecosystems and some marine protected areas, the Chavez Marine Reserve. Sustainable water supply. Some cautionary tales about it as well. So we talked in the last lecture about a small town of Lake Placid that actually has a water reuse system. But water recycling. In many parts of the world, I think Tokyo is a place where they've actually been able to take water for years from treated wastewater and recycle it and reuse it. Well, that's what we're talking about. We can purify water and reuse it in industry, farms, and even in our homes. So we're not quite to that point yet, although there's some talk of that. Not to drink. Don't worry about that. Water recycling reduces that pressure because we have that limited amount of groundwater. We only have that one source, and that reduces the pressure on those surface water sources and here in the groundwater source here in Central Florida. Also reduces a lot of water pollution. Reuse of wastewater is a vital part of water conservation efforts in Florida. I have a graphic that shows how important it has become and how it's helping us to extend our water supplies. Extending our water supplies. Hey, just like I was saying there a second ago. Use that highly treated wastewater for irrigation rather than pumping up fresh water. Most of the water that is used for irrigation, particularly in municipalities, is the same stuff that you would drink. Why would you irrigate with water that's been treated for drinking? Anyway, reuse saves drinking water. The single largest use of treated drinking water is for lawn irrigation. This is 100 million gallon Land O'Lakes Reclaimed Water Reservoir. That's in the west coast of Florida. So we have to, if we're to directly discharge this water to surface waters, we have to treat it to drinking water standards. So why directly discharge it? Why not use it for irrigation? There's a problem, and this is from the St. Johns River Water Management District. A friend of mine worked there for many years, Dr. Marzoff. So when you have reclaimed water, where do the nutrients go? Well, there is a potential. Yes, there certainly is a potential for those nutrients from reclaimed water to make it back into water bodies. We have to take care of that. That's a problem that needs to be addressed and is being addressed, making the most of reuse water. Just like you can't ignore other activities, stormwater runoff, whatever it is, fertilizer, don't put too much fertilizer on. Maintain maintain your septic systems. All those things. Reuse can't just be ignored. You can't say it's a panacea. There have to be constraints. There has to be limits on how much reuse you can use, because we have seen some municipalities have been fined for violating water quality standards because they dump too much reuse water into lakes. Now, got to pay attention to that stuff. This is the balance. The balance, I hope that you can see all this. If not, it'll be on the PDF. You'll be able to see it then. Balance between reuse and water protection. So this graphic starts out in 1980. That's the beginning point of it. Back in 1980, our total use of water was in the range of about 225 million gallons a day. That's what this graphic is showing us. That's how much tree wastewater we had. 225 million gallons a day. Today, where are we today? Well, this graphic, this is some Southwest Florida Water Management District. 2008, we're using about 100 million gallons of a day more treated wastewater was flowing. The goal, if you can see that goal box is right there, is 75% reuse water. Well, 75% reuse water in 2008 was 184 million gallons a day, and by 2008 we were actually reusing 162 million gallons a day. That's how much reclaimed water was being used, saving 106 million gallons of water a day from being pumped. Tremendous amount of use of it. And as we go forward into the future, obviously this graphic is just on the increase in terms of both the amount of wastewater we use and the amount of reuse water that's available and the amount of savings. So, a lot of effort into reuse. Some cities have suffered those water quality violations I talked about in the previous slide. Wetlands. Moving a little bit downstream, this is actually Highlands Hammock State Park, HHSP for short, because my handwriting's not that great. But wetlands are not continually underwater. It's wet land. The soil, though, is either permanently or frequently wet. Doesn't support upland plants. You won't find big honking oak trees and stuff like that, or you'll find some smaller trees. Most of this is cypress. But wetlands are very important in terms of flood protections. Speaking of wetland, this is the Kissimmee River. We've talked about it a bit. We'll talk about it some more. The difference between these two slides, I use that triangle sign there to mean difference. What's the difference between these two slides besides, well, how many years is that? 60 years, 61 years? Well, this is the original river. You see this broad floodplain along here. This is a restored. The former channel of the river is over here, and once again, we've restored that broad floodplain of the river. So you have gone in 61 years back to where we started. Why have we done that? Well, because of the need for improvement, the need for water quality, the need for water storage, and then tremendous improvement we've seen over the channelized river in terms of bird populations and fish populations and just the overall wilderness along there. Inland wetlands are disappearing all around the world. The very highly productive centers for biodiversity. We talked about biodiversity before, talk about it again. Provide natural flood and erosion control. That's one thing that wetlands, they're supposed to be wet. They're supposed to flood up. They're supposed to hold water. They're very natural filters. When you take out that kidney, the nutrients they don't get cleaned up. They go straight into the lake. They cause all kinds of problems. Wetlands will convert those nutrients into biomass and store it as soil or whatever. That's what this is, actually a base swamp. But what's happening, this is a freshwater system. See that? That's actually a lake, on the edge of a lake. And what happens when sea levels rise? Well, those freshwater systems are going to be impacted, particularly those near the coast. They're going to die out, so we have to address that as well. There are laws for protection of wetlands. In fact, it's hard to dig in a wetland. It's hard to dig in a wetland because it's hard to do, but it's also, the rules have cut wetland loss by 80%. So we're protecting a lot more wetland, but the truth of the matter is the only wetland left to protect is the stuff that's hard to build on anyway. Some places local laws are more restrictive, particularly if wetlands are a threatened habitat or a biodiversity hotspot. We might have some around here. Talk about those in a much later chapter. Mitigation banking. Some ecologists look at this as being a last resort. Putting land, why don't we just save it all? Well, we can't really save all that land. It's a tool, in my opinion, to create permanent reservations for that managed land. Tools. There are a lot of examples locally of wetland mitigation. This is actually link to a blog from the Archipel Biological Station, which is very, very, very interesting. I think this image is from a place called the MacArthur Agroecology Center. Actually, it's a farm down south part of Highlands County. So, 3 examples we'll give. Well, 2 main examples. Officiating Creek watershed. We'll look at where that is. 26,000 acres set aside for water storage, wetland restoration. A smaller project, and there are several projects up in this part of the county, which is on the east side. Arbuckle Creek, recently set aside. Several other sources of funding for this, because you have to, basically you're paying the farmers for environmental services. Northern Everglades Payment for Environmental Services program is what's funding a lot of these things. So, first of all, this is the Officiating Creek Wetland Reserve Program. Where that red circle is approximately where it's located. Officiating Creek flows from this part of the county down and makes a turn and goes into Lake O, big lake off the map there. 26,000 acres, permanent conservation is in place in this area. Can't do anything with it except farm it, maybe. Once in place, all of these things that are being put in place on the land, the water storage and all those sorts of components, will be paid for, maintained by the landowners. They get a lot of money for this. A lot of money. Millions and millions of dollars. So they're supposed to invest that and do this. This is all managed through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Moving to the eastern part of the county, this is the Hart Ranch. S.Y. Hart Ranch. And that ranch happens to be located here. Arbuckle Creek flows out of Polk County, flows down and flows into Lake Estopoga, about right there. But there are several other locations up and down Arbuckle Creek where there are wetland protections, wetland conservation areas. This one, put in place by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. 2,500 acres, relatively small, relatively modest, but still very important. I mean, that's still a lot of land. Rural and Family Lands Protection Program of the state of Florida, right there. Moving a little further downstream, from Lake O to Florida Bay. This term, rivergrass, you may have heard it, coined by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who was a really influential writer in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I think she passed away in the 90s. She talked about the river of grass, 100 miles wide, 6 inches deep, natural flow of water from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay. It existed. It's hard to find today. But we like to live here. It's a beautiful place, so we decided, hey, we've got to do something about this. We are going to simply dredge it, ditch it, make it so that it all drains. And this is an excellent book. It's not a part of the course, but I recommend it. It actually talks about here, this central part of Florida and what happened 150, 200 years ago, and moves forward into a little more contemporary setting. Excuse me. So, before development, you had this tremendous flow of water. Look at that broad, that's the river of grass. The ridge and slough system is all throughout all this, and the water simply flowed into Florida Bay down here. After development, it's not quite so clear. There's agriculture here. The Kissimmee River has been channelized here. The Kissimmee River is a free-flowing stream. There's I-75 coming across here, US 27 going down there. There's Tamiami Trail going there. We have carved it up after development, certainly. More graphic vegetation map, or more descriptive. 1943, this John Henry Davis. Most of this yellow area here, you probably can't make it out of the key, is actually Sawgrass Marsh. Most of that is gone. In fact, I would say all of that is gone. But all of this is a variety of wetland plant species. Hopefully you'll be able to see more of that on the PDF file. Originally, now she said 100 miles wide. On that southern tip of Florida, it's not quite that wide. But anyway, Originally it was between 40 and 70 miles wide, 3,500 square miles. Large chunk of territory, covered most of these counties, Broward, Dade, and Monroe. But since 1948 we've ditched, drained, diverted, paved over large portions of it, mostly ditching and draining. Nutrient pollution from agriculture and urban development. We can't leave the urban development. Certainly ag has played its part. A big part of it is the fact that we've changed the flow. We don't allow the water to go where it used to go because we don't like flooding. There's actually some invasive species that were seeded in this area on purpose by airplane in the 1920s. They actually flew over the Everglades. Hey, let's dry it up. Let's use these seeds, these trees called melaleuca trees. Well, they grow fast, but they exclude everything else, and they don't actually dry anything up. They did establish Everglades National Park, but what did that do? It didn't do a whole lot, actually. Mainly because we kept ditching and draining. Had to keep that flooding going. This is really the genesis of a lot of the protections that we have in place, and this was a series. This is in memoriam to the lives who were lost in the 1928 hurricane. Hurricane came in, the Moorhaven flood victims. Moorhaven is a little town south and east of Lake Okeechobee. Before there was a big dike around the lake, the people who lived in Moorhaven, well, like everybody else, they were farmers. Hurricane came in, blew all the water to one side of Lake Okeechobee, exposed all the floodplain, the flats, and all the fish, hundreds of fish, thousands of fish. So the people ran out and grabbed the fish. Well, they didn't understand about storm surge. And the eye of the storm came over, and it was nice and clear. Oh, the storm's over with. And then they're all out on the mud flats, and the storm surge returned, and they drowned. Basically, 1,600 lives. A lot of them are actually buried around here. So that was the genesis for a lot more of the ditching and draining that went on. Current flow. This is historic. Saw that natural image earlier. Current flow. Lots of flow to the east and west. Lots of flow here to the lower east coast because this is where water supply is needed. So looking at restoration. Now there's a problem. There's a lot of haggling. 1970s political haggling. It's a plumbing project that's not really working. It's sort of providing water, but the water's not what they want. There's too much water going here, too much water going there. So what you going to do? 1970s. A lot of stakeholders involved in this thing. In 1990, it took a little while to come up with this thing called the SERP, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. I love a good acronym. The idea, and this has largely taken place, although it won't be finished for another few years, is to restore a lot of the Kissimmee River to a natural flowing river. Right up here, comes down there. Remove a bunch of canals and levees in certain locations, and then flood 240 square kilometers, not miles, kilometers of farmland, creating artificial marshes, mostly south of Lake Okeechobee. And the goal was supposedly to restore the Everglades. The goal was to protect water. So, created reservoirs is still a goal. In fact, we are still meeting and talking about this. This is recorded in 2016. We have another plan, another 30-year plan in place. I hate to sound negative about it, but we got to get some stuff done here. Going to create reservoirs, which we are doing, and underground water storage areas. A lot of effort being put into that. Still building new canals, being more efficient in our pumping systems. We're going back to that reuse slide. We can do a better job of this. The original SERP, use that acronym, had nothing north of Lake Okeechobee. I mean, you can't protect Lake Okeechobee from too much water or the wrong kind of nutrients by working south of it. You have to work north of it. Get off the soapbox. Okay. Originally, the SERP had nothing north of Lake O and did nothing to actually restore the flows from the lake to Florida Bay. Original, 1990s. So why isn't the plan working? Why haven't we done something now? Because the government works very slowly. I work for government, I know that. The plan wasn't originally really about restoration. It was really about ensuring a water supply for the lower east coast of Florida, and it has done that. A lot of special interests, Won't go into who those are, but they keep the science at bay from doing what we know we need to do. Until very recently, weren't looking up north. Home for restoration. This is a dated thing. This is Jessica Pollock's history of the Everglades, but it has some very interesting pictures and some interesting information. Let's say it was dated. It wasn't updated after 2006, so their future plans may not show much, but there's some interesting history to read on there. So the water doesn't flow where it once did. We now have downstream problems in Florida Bay. It's still technically estuary. Estuary is where saltwater and freshwater mix down here in Florida Bay. But freshwater flows historically made it a very rich fishery. Got all that sheet flow, bringing all that water into Florida Bay, keeping the salinity at the right levels. Now we don't have this. Salinity can get up to twice as high as in the open ocean because we've broken the plumbing. We broke pipes, so to speak. So we've channelized a lot of things. Too much salt. The changes were noticed beginning in the 1980s. Probably could have been noticed before then. This is actually a map showing salinity, seasonal spatial distribution of freshwater flow and salinity. Those orange areas mean it's really, really salty in those areas. Seagrass doesn't like salt. It likes, well, like some salt, but just the right amount. A lot of algal blooms. Algae can grow in this stuff. The sponges died and the fishery declined. Economics are suddenly taking a hit. 1990 began to address the problems, but not nearly enough was known about it. What were the historic conditions? Salinity, nutrients. How did Florida Bay formerly behave? What happened with it? How did the water flow? And what are the solutions to these problems? Well, restore the flow seems easy enough, but it's not all that easy because you have Miami right there, sort of. 2015, this is a letter, an opinion letter that was written actually by a governing board member of the South Florida Water Management District. His family's lived in the area for generations, and in 1948 they've been farming since 1948. Why is there too little fresh water going into Florida Bay? Way too much water nearby on his farm because of plumbing. This is 2015. We've been doing this for a while. So this is this is a year later, recording this in 2016. Everglades Foundation has put out a criticism, and South Florida Water Management District responded to it by basically saying this is what we're now doing to help Florida Bay, and they are, but it's going to take time. They're restoring this freshwater flow into Florida Bay. How long is it going to take? Don't know. We also saw tremendous changes in the rainfall regime. And this is cyclic. This is something that we haven't really observed, haven't paid close enough attention to, haven't collected the data on until recently. More fresh water is going to promote, of course this is a graphic, a cartoon if you will, it's going to promote seagrass recovery, healthy ecosystems, yes, all that stuff. A lot of things are being implemented to restore this flow, and they are actually moving dirt, which is the term for it. So they're going to break down some weir structures. These are little point sources, you can't really see them. And send additional water through certain canals. Going to connect a thing called a frog pond, kind of a cute little name for it, but it's a detention system to move more water towards this thing called the Taylor Slough and ultimately into Shark River Slough, trying to move all this water back into Florida Bay. To learn more about it, recommend it. southflorida.gov, Florida Bay. So let's move a little bit further east or west, halfway around the world. I guess you can get there either way. This is Southeast Asia. Looking at Vietnam, Cambodia, all of those countries in Southeast Asia, kind of a peninsula, sort of like Florida. Dolphins Irrawaddy is the species of dolphin that actually lives in fresh and salt water. They're estuarine species, restricted to only 3 rivers. They had been in many rivers: the Mekong, the Mekhama, and the Irrawaddy. I don't know why they don't just call it the Irrawaddy, but they're always changing the names of things so that I can't pronounce them, and that's just my own personal beef. Mine not. Right now, not a laughing matter at all, is that the population of these dolphins, these snub-nosed dolphins, is less than 100 individuals. Dropped from recently 200 in the last 10 years, being lost to this thing called bycatch. Dolphins are a top predator. They help keep things cleaned up. They do a wonderful job. Not only that, they're really cool to watch swim. Just, you know, seeing these guys jump out of the water. Won't be able to do that for much longer if there aren't some protections being put in place. Bycatch. Talked about bycatch in a previous lecture. Bycatch is where you're not trying to catch the dolphins, but guess what? They get caught in a net. Can't get them out. Mangroves. Coastal wetlands. This is a mangrove forest here and some seagrass beds. Moving out to coral reefs. So important economic services. Mangrove forests occupy 70% of the available shoreline. There are 69 different species of trees which make up these different mangroves. That's a lot of trees. Coastal ecosystems, same sort of things that freshwater ecosystems do. They remove excess plant nutrients, turn that actually into biomass, into wood. They store sediments, keeping that sediment in check, allowing the land to build up. Of course, sometimes estuarine systems need that sediment. That's where they need it, is in this area. As far as from a human standpoint, they're a tremendous source of food. A lot of the fish species that we eat, or certainly that indigenous peoples eat, come from these areas. Timber, fuel wood, habitat. Lots of habitat. And an important point is mangroves are tremendously important for protecting from storm surge from storms, from hurricanes or tropical storms. You can build a lot of concrete walls, but if you leave the mangrove in place, it's already anchoring that shoreline, it does a far better job. Yeah, it'll get kind of beat up, but it protects the shoreline behind it, kind of like fringing dunes do also. I'll talk about that in a later chapter, I believe, also as well. This is cool. Solenterates. Solenterates. That may roll off the top of the slide, but you'll see it on the PDF. Corals, jellyfish, animals with this stuff called radial symmetry. Symmetry, not symmetry. Basically, they're circles and everything radiates out from the center, kind of like a starfish sort of thing. So, coral is an animal, vegetable, and mineral. Technically, it's an animal. No arms, eyes, ears, or things that we consider. But coral contains algae. Coral polyps benefit from the sugar and oxygen that the plant, this algae, this zooxanthellae, gives off. And the plant, the algae, grows inside. It's structurally protected from the surrounding waters. It gets nutrients from the animal. Surround themselves in a limestone house. All that coral, we think of as coral reefs, that structure is excreted by these dudes here, by all these solenterates, corals and jellyfish. Just like jellyfish, and I didn't know this till I was doing the research for this particular lecture, they have stinging cells, just like jellyfish do. So man-o-war, this is not a man-o-war, but it's still, that's how it protects itself and captures its food through those stinging cells, just like jellyfish. Formed by colonies of these tiny animals, talked about just a second ago. The polyps excrete calcium carbonate, limestone. They have these shells that they're putting off. 0.2% of the ocean floor. I mean, the ocean makes up 71% of the Earth's surface. 0.2% of that is where the coral reefs are. This is where the highest biodiversity is happening. Important for carbon dioxide removal. Important protection from erosion. These massive structures dissipate waves as the waves get near shore. 1/4 of all the fish species are found there, and 1/4 of all the fish caught developing countries are associated with coral reefs. That is where this is that biodiversity hotspot. 0.2% of the ocean floor. Very important. but it's threatened. Pollution, the warming ocean. Animals that live in the ocean have a fairly, at least these sorts of animals, have a very narrow tolerance, a temperature range tolerance. Also, this carbon dioxide increase, we'll talk about that in I keep saying this, we'll talk about it later. I'll get to it. We'll talk about this in a later chapter. Carbon dioxide levels are increasing globally. They are. We've seen them increase. We've been tracking this for many years. But when you put more carbon dioxide in the water, it actually lowers the pH of the water, makes it more acidic. Limestone dissolves in acid. That's a problem. We also have development along the coast. Many parts of the world, that's where humans live. So we develop along the coast, we impact coral reefs from that development. Just by changing how the water flows and how much sediment gets out there or putting more out there, we change things. So we have a very large tract of coral reefs. Runs from the Dry Tortugas, kind of northwest, sort of northwest-ish of Key West, all the way around to the St. Lucie Inlet, which is on the east coast, about due east of Highlands County. Quite a range, 200 or 300 miles long. They're closely related to barrier reefs, but actually are not barrier reefs. They're actually called bank reefs. This is in Florida. This is not some foreign country. This is right here, home. 45 species of stony coral, 37 species of octocorals, sea fans and less structural corals, dominated by staghorn corals, as you can see in that image there. Moving offshore just a little bit, we have this thing called the Chavez Marine Protected Area. And this is actually, if you go to the map, this is actually the Indian Ocean. Write it on there. A little place, where is it on there? Oh, it's down here. This is a place called Diego Garcia. DGAR for short. Just a fairly significant naval base for the United States. We'll talk more about that on a personal level in a bit. Chavez. It's a fully no-take marine reserve. It is the world's now second largest marine reserve at almost 400,000 square miles. It was the largest one until August of 2016 when the United States managed to make a bigger one around Hawaii, but this is far more protected because there's nothing out here except these tropical islands. Unspoiled coral reefs. 6,000 meter deep trench. Incredible habitat diversity, and if we don't protect it, it's going to be threatened. So, you got all this. This is just beautiful, beautiful territory. Completely no extraction. You can't have any industrial fishing. You can't even go there as a tourist because there's no tourist boats. I mean, you can go there if you have some. You go if you happen to make it to. This is east of the Seychelles. If you happen to get out there somehow or other, you couldn't rent a tourist boat to go and see things. You'd have to go with a local fisherman or do some scientific research. I think this is the British down here doing some surveying. The world's largest coral atoll, world's cleanest coral reefs. They are damaged somewhat by warming ocean temperatures, but they can recover quickly from that. These and other marine protected areas, MPAs, love my acronyms, don't give up my acronyms. They serve as nursery areas for coral reefs in other part of the Indian Ocean. They are spreading, continuously repairing these coral reefs in other parts of the Indian Ocean. So there is always a price to be paid. This is DGAR. As I say, home to a few submarines. That happens to be the USS Florida. But the amount of protections that they aren't even allowed to discharge waste, which is unusual for the Navy. They have to pump their waste onshore and take care of it that way. Interesting thing. So, fill in the blanks. What have we answered here? What is the natural receiving water body for the Lake Okeechobee watershed? Everybody raise your hands for Florida Bay. Yeah. Irrawaddy River dolphins are found in the Irrawaddy River, but that's located in estuary systems in Southeast Asia, several of them. Not just the Irrawaddy, which is no longer called the Irrawaddy, but the Mekong and some others. Coral reefs are the marine ecosystem with the highest level of biodiversity. You already knew that answer. You knew that was the answer to that one. And where is the Chavez Marine Reserve? Now you know. It's in the Indian Ocean. Talked about creating sustainable water supply systems. Reuse. Tremendously important in urban areas in Florida. Reducing our dependence upon that groundwater. Very important and used extensively. There are some problems. You can't just go willy-nilly and do what you want to do. Oh, it's a panacea. No, you can still put too much nutrients in surface waters. So wetlands and Fish-Eating Creek, Arbuckle Creek, like shorthand. Those systems are being protected by putting land in reserve, by no longer farming it, protecting it. Well, actually, in the Fish-Eating Creek example, they were going to put a city that was supposed to have a population of 65,000 people there, but they canceled that. Looked at the Everglades of Florida Bay, spent some time talking about comprehensive Everglades restoration. And still in a freshwater system, Dolphins of the Irrawaddy, Florida Bay, Estuary, Irrawaddy, estuarine systems. Coastal wetlands, mangroves, seagrasses to coral reefs. Looked at mangroves and seagrasses, how important those mangroves are for protecting the shoreline and protecting and supporting actually us. Florida corals, a lot more extensive than you think, goes from dry tortugas all the way around the St. Lucie Inlet, hundreds of miles. Coral reef ecosystems and marine protected areas in the Chavez Marine Reserve. References, a lot of them this time. There's also some annotations. I've got a link to, where is that? Land Remembered is right there if you want to find that. Pineapple Press, Everglades, Priceless Florida Ecosystems. Some good reading, matter of fact.